Shackelford.
And I'm Edidiong, Obot.
And this is
Fresh Perspective.
It's a show where we talk about politics, civics, and community, and us coming together as one across the diaspora. And this is part 2 of Race and Justice, a conversation we started on last week, looking at a conference that was held here by The Atlantic, a national publication. And we left off in the last episode, we were talking about some of the psychological component as it relates to our police department, and looking at how we can better do some things from that vantage point to get, I guess, a better overall product as it relates to our police department. And so, Diddy, you were talking about some of the challenges of that aspect of policing, and maybe there should be more done on the front end. I know that they do, I feel like, some type of baseline testing. I don't know how in-depth it is. And one of the responses that I got from an officer off camera, if you will, was that if they were to do more of these in-depth psychological evaluations, then we wouldn't have police force. And, you know, I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing, because people have to understand their strengths. Like, I know for me, I don't have the temperament, the makeup to be a police officer. That's not for me.
See, I think I do.
And, okay, but I'm good with that. And I feel like there are individuals within the police force that, quite honestly, should not be there. I know some very good ones. They've been on the force for a long time. And, well, I don't have, clearance to say their names, but they've been doing some very good work, and they love their jobs, and they've seen some crazy things on the job. And so, to your point, that was why I was also a proponent of looking at the psychological component, and not just doing something on the forefront, but on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
How are we supporting these officers and making sure that they're okay to go back out there and do the job that we need them to do, and not being negatively impacted by a bad experience that will then shape how they interact with citizens that share a similar background, complexion, what have you, moving forward, because that serves no one any good in terms of what we need them to do and what they're there for.
I think that's good, too, to kind of touch on. We don't necessarily touch about police officers and what they see. Though they are trained to deal with different types of situations, doesn't mean that they're not human beings, right? And you still have to kind of play in for that human emotion that you're going to have. It may be a traumatic experience that this police officer has never been in this situation before, and having to now leave this traumatic experience, going through it, living it, or even be a part of that scene on that specific day, and then tomorrow go out and you may experience another kind of, traumatic thing that's happening, but you are the police force, so you're there to protect and serve. But, realize that these police officers are not robots. They're also human beings like you and I. I think that's one component that we have to really consider, like you said, ongoing. And I'm quite sure that they probably have something like that, but maybe making it more robust where it's comprehensive and not just a one-day sit-in or a 2-day. And I'm not saying that that's what they do, but,
Right.
just kind of having that program more robust and having it for the police officers to feel comfortable enough to come and say, hey, this is what happened today in our daily log, and, this is how I'm feeling. Because they still have families that they have to go to. They still have children that they're going to be, playing with and having to have these conversations with their own children. One thing I think that will also help in regard to, like, what can we do to help retrain police officers is really kind of going into the community and understanding that specific community, right? Whether that's the Asian community, whether it's the African community, the African American, or the Hispanic, because the community is made up of different types of people, different types of cultures, different backgrounds. So if you're able to kind of understand where each is coming from, then you police differently. You don't police all the same. We understand crime is crime, but then it's another level that you can take towards that, right? And I think that having that understanding from a police standpoint, you're going to treat that person a little differently, especially for those who are like in the immigrant community, right? Some of them may have just came here, they may not know English as well, and you don't want to be that police officer that treats them differently. Oh, they're an immigrant, I don't know what they're saying, we're going to book you and take you down to the station. As opposed to like understanding like, okay, is there somebody who speaks English here, or maybe you may get on the phone with an interpreter from the police department to help you understand what's going on with this person. This person may have just called for something simple, you know, hey, I can't do this, or I don't know where this is at, or this is happening in my community. And they may not be able to communicate it well, but if the police department is not in a rush to judge or use that bias and are able to say, okay, well, what is going on? And I'm not saying that they don't do that, you know, but if we have more of that happening, I think that you have less of this, like, underlying notion that, you know, you can't really trust the police kind of thing, right? I think that obviously there are police officers, like you said, that are doing great work in the community. And one thing in that panel that was brought up was this term of crimmigration, right? Where it's where criminal law and the immigration law kind of meet itself, right? And you have what he talked about in that he's talking from a Hispanic immigration community. I mean, you can kind of make this overall to any immigration community where you have immigrants who come here and they're living their life, right? And they see something going wrong in their community. Maybe it's in their apartment, maybe it's abuse, or maybe it's, you know, somebody who's stealing or whatever. And they want to call the police, but they're apprehensive to call the police because they're undocumented, or they just feel like if I call the police, then they're going to ask me for my own papers, so I'm not going to even say anything. I'm not even going to call. Like you mentioned that it's been documented that at least 40% of Hispanic women have reported rape. Doesn't mean that more than that is not happening. It's just that's what's been reported, because you have some who, you know, maybe going through that experience and are afraid of going there, because you have ICE that will, in other parts of the country, ICE is just coming in and just waiting for you to, you know, be in your apartment. They're doing apartment sweeps of undocumented people. That's how crucial like this thing is happening, where people are afraid to even call the police, and if they do call the police, they don't want to say anything. It's like, I didn't see anything, I don't know anything. So it's like, I think from that aspect, it's not from a local police policing aspect, which Sheriff Gonzalez talked about, where they've kind of stopped that program in Houston or Harris County at least, where that voluntary like helping with the ICE, making sure that there's a divorce between local police and ICE, so that people are not scared to call your local police if crime is happening, and not afraid to say, hey, this is what's happening, without having a fear of being separated from their family and actually having to be deported or anything like that.
Absolutely. And I remember that particular panel because that was very eye-opening for me, because I didn't realize some of those things were taking place. Like you said, people are fearful to call the police because they're worried about getting deported. And so as a result, they're not putting out the information that the police need to go in, apprehend these individuals that are committing crimes, committing rape, people that we need to get off the street. And so there definitely is a lot of not only education that needs to be done within the immigrant community, but finding more trusted messengers, if you will, that are able to share that. Because I think while it will help to have officers obviously go into that community, if it's not done in conjunction with someone from those communities that they already trust, it's not going to be received the same. And we've seen that even within, you know, the black community, when people who are, you know, deemed outsiders, if you will, try and bring information to us, there's an element of mistrust because you don't know their intentions, you don't know what their motives are. And so until we're able to better establish some of those relationships, those partners that are in those communities, as far as the undocumented and immigrant communities, to partner with the police department, or do more of it, I should say. I don't know if we'll really make the headway that we need to. It was very positive hearing that you have the sheriff and other individuals that are in law enforcement that are very clear that if you call them, they're not trying to call ICE.
Right.
They're there to address a crime or whatever the call is concerning. And so if you are a part of that immigrant community, which I know part of our audience is, take that into mind, or take that into account, I should say. Be mindful of that, that if you feel like you're being taken advantage of, you feel like you're being abused, or you see people committing crimes, don't be afraid to call the police, because in a lot of instances, it's as simple as things just don't get reported.
Right. And I think that that's key, because when we start talking about data and statistics of, you know, this community surfaced this amount, whatever, they're looking at how it's being reported, right? If it's even being reported. And if we are not communicating that to the police officers, those numbers are skewed, right? They don't have an actual depiction of what's going on in your community because you're afraid to report, or you just kind of close your eyes to it. You know, you're like, that's not my problem. It is our problem, right? It's our community problem. So if somebody's going through it and this is happening in our community, we need to kind of take that, like, you know, I care about my community aspect to report it. If not, then these things continue to happen and you end up having a community that's deemed for, I mean, you look at like this and that now. Like when I grew up there, it was middle class, you had condos, apartments, being and everything like that. And now when you walk up and down, you see prostitution happening. You see, you know, violence happening. You see all manners of things that are happening. And not to say people haven't called a report, but you need more people to continue to do that so that the community kind of looks the way that you want it to look, right? You move there for a certain reason. You're raising your children there. You know, you want it to be safe. You know, you want it to be empowering. So those are some few things that, like, being a part of your community, making those reports, calling the police when you see things not, you know, going the way that they're supposed to be going. You see crime, call the police.
Absolutely.
They're there to help us, not to, you know, harm us. Although that's what the media shows. But like Ray said earlier, there are some good police officers doing great work, and you know, you don't want to you know, overshadow the entire police force because you have few police officers that are kind of taking the limelight from those good police officers doing great work.
And you made me think of a quote when you were talking, and I'm paraphrasing this from Dr. King. It was basically stating that a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Right.
And so when you see something, say something, and I feel like, again, based on the leadership we have to make sure that we take advantage of it. We have an opportunity to really take some significant strides as it relates to criminal justice within the city of Houston, within Harris County, and I feel like we're positioned to be at the forefront of some of those changes, not only within the state, but also within the country. As soon as we come back from this next break, we're going to take our conversation in a little bit of a different direction as we wrap up the race and justice conversation.
And we're back. This is Fresh Perspective. I am Edidiong Obot, and my co-host Ray Shackelford. And we're talking about race and justice here. Before this segment, we were talking about crimmigration, and now we want to kind of move that discussion into something else where we're talking about criminal justice reform and kind of figuring out what success looks like. So Ray, like, what's your idea on like what success looks like in that aspect?
So from one of the panels, there was a gentleman who had a comment, and I think it was actually a question from the audience, potentially, and they asked about looking at some of the success from countries in Europe.
Okay.
Because if you look at the United States in comparison to a lot of our counterparts, we are one of the most over-policed, over-prisoned. I don't think that's the actual term, but when you look at how much of our population has been put into the prison system and how much of it is being policed, we don't have the right formula, because clearly we've been doing this model for a while. It's not working.
Right.
You have what's called now the school and prison pipeline.
Right. Yeah.
That has been thriving. You have the privatization of prisons. You have people that are profiting from the prison industry. And so even there was mention, and I didn't know this until I went to that conference, you have entire communities within the state of Texas where their economies are completely dependent upon prisons.
Prison system.
And so while in the Obama administration we saw that they started to decentivize or take away the private prison or start to remove those, under this new administration you've seen an influx of now they're bringing it back. Why? Because there's profitability, there's money to be made. And so that's, I think, one of the core issues with our criminal justice system is people stand to make money off of it, which doesn't really line up when you start talking about justice, because if the objective is to actually rehabilitate people and get them back to being productive citizens, which obviously our prison system is not set up to do that, then you wouldn't be trying to benefit or make money off of it.
Right.
It was basically put in place to take the place of slavery. You have these individuals that are in these prisons that you can now use as a workforce or make money off of from different vantage points. And so within Europe, in a lot of instances, they have completely empty prisons. You know, they're tearing them down, they're repurposing them for other things. They don't have as much of a need or use for police. And so violence as a whole is something that is very rampant within our country. Some people point to video games and things of that nature. I don't know how much of a role that plays, because even with this most recent tragedy that took place in Santa Fe.
Yeah, close to home.
And there was another one that I think just took place, forgive me the state, but again, there was reference of the violence in video games. And we even had a politician within the state of Texas who was talking about decentivizing those video game producers or individuals that make products that kind of celebrate violence or highlight that or make it to be in a positive light.
Right.
And so we keep using the term layers, there's a lot of layers
Right.
to the prison system or criminal justice reform as a whole, and how do we get to a good place. But I think first and foremost, taking out the profitability component of it, and really getting to a place where we're focusing on rehabilitation and addressing things like mental health,
Right.
and categorizing those things appropriately. You've even seen with the recent epidemic of opioids within the white community, now there's a much more compassionate outlook on those individuals that are using those drugs,
Right.
versus when you look at the crack epidemic,
War on drugs.
when that was in our communities, and how it was treated. It wasn't
Right.
treated as a mental health issue. It was something that people were demonized and ultimately locked up for, with no consideration for whether or not there was a mental health component or other aspects that were leading to this. And you touched on that, I think, in part one, when we talk about people's needs
Right. So like, I also want to add to that in terms of like what does success look like, and I'll even take it a step further back. And that panel, they address education, right? And you just mentioned now the school to prison pipeline. I think it even starts with those who are who are in students, high schoolers, middle schoolers. In that panel discussion, there was a audience member who talked, and even in the panel, they had a young African American male who's a rising sophomore at Prairie View, and he talked about he grew up in Sunnyside, which is a historic Black community here in Houston, Texas. And he talked about, even from his own standpoint, that some of the challenges is that leadership, authoritative figures don't truly understand where these students are coming from in terms of their economic background, their family background, whatever, and what causes them to act out. And there was a young gentleman on the panel who I think works for the city of Houston, I can't remember his name, but he also kind of spoke towards this. He used to be a former educator where in his classroom he taught science. And in his classroom he saw those students who acted out as a form of leadership, right? And was able to turn those kind of things into positive things in the classroom. Not every teacher is like that, right? And so it's kind of like, how can we address that student without setting them up for that prison in the future, right? We also talked about was how in the educational system, not abusing the referral system, right? When your child gets referred, you already feel like they're already in trouble for whatever, right? That referral system is actually to be put in place to refer that child to the best person that can actually address the needs of that child, not to send them to in-school suspension and that's it. So what he was saying was that even in the school system, it's almost as if they kind of already set the student up to be prepared for prison, because something happens, and rather than it being handled in the classroom, maybe the teacher's not able to handle it, it gets sent up to the assistant principal. And then from there, it might escalate because the student is not performing or behaving in the manner that you want them to. And it gets escalated to a alternative school. And if they don't do well there, most times either they drop out or they're already into the juvenile prison system. And that kind of, it's kind of like one of those systematic things where can we stop it? And I think that can start from at least one part of it, not the whole thing put in on educators, but that can be a part of addressing it from the educational standpoint. Obviously there's more to it, like we said, layers, from the family standpoint, your parents being involved. But for those who don't have parents, and school is that standpoint where you can meet them at what can we do there. Because I remember there was actually a recent incident that I was one of my friends were discussing, and this student, something happened with this student. The student was undocumented, and the police were called on this student in school. ICE became an issue, and another teacher had to really intervene for this student so that the student doesn't get deported, right? And that's just from the immigration standpoint. We're not even talking about from African American students that, something bad may have happened. One small thing now turns into something that follows them into their adulthood, and that came from something that could have been rectified at the high school, middle school, elementary level, as opposed to just kind of escalating it to, well, you don't want to listen to me? Here's the AP, and then the AP takes it to the principal, and then it just kind of keeps circling. It's not something that we're able to finally address, and I don't know if that means for the teachers, them being retrained, and how to deal with students, because honestly, I know that teachers get underpaid, for what they do. Same thing with police officers, like they get paid to protect and serve, they put their lives on the line. I'm not comparing the two, but in regards to maybe even retraining some of the teachers and how they deal with these students that come from different economic backgrounds, and even, what's going on in their family, how can we get, them the training that they need to address a child that might act up, I think that also might be a form of success in a sense where you tackle it not only from the police side, from the education side, even from the family side, like, putting together programs for parents or a support system for the individual to lean on when things are not going the way that they hoped for, or things are not working out in their favor and it causes them to act out and commit crime or do whatever. Setting up those kind of programs might help in shaping what that success looks like.
No, and that definitely plays a role. And to your point, one of the challenges is that because they're so heavily underpaid, how do you bring that about? And so, as we're talking, one of my thoughts was, when they see that a child is not reading at a certain level, I believe it's second grade, first and second grade, where they start building prisons based on them not reading at that level. And so, if we divert whatever funds where they're pulling that from, and again, that goes to the profitability component.
Yeah.
But if they would reinvest that into some of the things that you're talking about, giving those teachers a more robust skill set. And I actually taught school in 6th through 8th grade, all boys school in 3rd Ward. These kids that came from Sunnyside, 5th Ward, different areas. And so when you're teaching in, an area that is economically disadvantaged,
right.
There are a lot more challenges as a teacher. You're not just teaching.
Right.
You have to be a psychologist, a
mentor,
counselor.
A lot of different things.
You wear a lot of different hats. And so I definitely do not want to put all that on the educators. They need more resources. And
exactly.
In the state of Texas, we no longer fully fund public education. And that's one of the things. There's been a lot of back and forth as it relates to Houston Independent School District. Some of the schools have been threatened with takeovers. But that education piece definitely is one of the underlying issues, and something that has to be addressed in order for us ultimately to get to what that picture of success looks like. And so there are some people that have started to do some good work in that space. I know there's a brother by the name of Marvin Pierre. He came out of Houston Black Leadership Institute. He has a program called 8 Billion Stories, where he works with youth that have come through the criminal justice system or come across some type of trouble or been labeled a certain way. He works with them to help complete their education, to get jobs, to get enrolled in colleges, to become productive members of society. He's been very successful over the past year rolling that program out with just a small group of kids. And so there are individuals like that that are finding a formula, and that's, on the back end,
right.
Trying to get them back on the right track versus focusing more on the front end and doing something from a preventative standpoint to where we don't even have to address it at those latter stages, but you have to attack it from both sides.
Right,
because
I think so.
You want to make sure that we're investing in those that are in that pre-K area to get them to where we want them to be projecting, 10, 15 years down the road, but also understanding that we have a very large segment that has already gone through XYZ, but we can't just cast them to the side as though they're just a lost cause.
Right.
And so finding that balance and putting more resources into solutions versus kind of curbing the situation. And I think when we're talking, I also thought about it. One of the things I've seen has been productive in trying to get some of that reform done. If you look at initiatives like what District Attorney Kim Ogg has done with the marijuana diversion, is because it saves taxpayers money.
Yeah.
So even though it's not deemed as profitable, it is a cost-cutting measure. So finding different things that we can put in place or policies that we can enact that are saving the city, the county money, and then being able to have those funds reallocated to different areas I think that again are things that we can look at as relates to a picture of success. Also, not classifying non-violent offenders in the same fashion that we do violent offenders. If you're not out here trying to harm people, trying to ultimately be a productive member of society, and really breaking down, doing more from a case management standpoint in terms of why are you committing these crimes. Somebody used the term survival crimes, and you touched on it in part one.
Yeah.
In terms of their needs, why are they ultimately doing the things they're doing, and really investigating that, because some of the communities that these people are coming from, they don't really have a lot of alternatives, and so it's very easy to sit up and look at them one way without really understanding where they're coming from, what they've had to deal with, and how they got to this point.
Right. So I think even in what you're saying, in terms of shaping what that success looks like, you talked about profitability, right? And kind of removing that component. I talked about education and, what can we do from the educator standpoint. And I want to kind of make sure I address this, I'm not saying that, we just retrain, but like you said, I like that term better, provide the necessary resources for the educators to use in regards to the students, and also on the back end as well, helping those students who may have slipped up on the back end, as what you mentioned with your friend Marvin Pierre, he's doing. I think that those are, some things that we can kind of bring to the table as resources or frames of success. There's a family component, obviously, that needs to happen. There's a community component that obviously needs to happen, and there are organizations that are already addressing that, right? We have mentorship programs with Urban League, the Boys and Girls Club, you have, your church family, you have, your, whatever it is that your community organization that can help address those needs, not just from a student or adolescent aspect, but even from adulthood, right? That it takes a village, right, to kind of make sure that you raise a child, but not only to raise a child, but to keep your community, right? So I think it's not just one thing, like we always say here, it's different layers that can add to that. I think for the race and justice, for us, we want to make sure that we bring a positive component to this, some kind of solution based, and not just point out what is going wrong, but also what are we doing right? What can we continue to do?
Absolutely. I'm thankful for the fact that the Atlantic brought that conference to the city. For me, I guess the big takeaway was that there's a lot of talk around criminal justice reform. I feel like that's positive. I feel like that there are some good things on the horizon, again, because people are seeing that there is money to be saved as a result of changing, but also because it's now impacting other communities that it has historically, they're willing to look at it through a different lens.
Different perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But with that being said, the one challenge that I also saw was that race is still not being addressed.
It's not being addressed, yeah.
Until we deal with that within our communities, within our country, we can't really get to where we need to be as a human race and come together collectively, because ultimately I think we all want to, so we can be in a better place overall. We thank you guys for joining us. Definitely let us know what you want to see on future episodes. My name is Ray Shackelford.
And I'm Edidiong. Obot.
This has been
Fresh Perspective.